My wife cheated with some guy. I left her and drove away, but when she called begging to fix everything, Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be the guy typing one of these posts, but here we are. My name's Jason, and I guess this is my way of venting or maybe looking for advice, though at this point, I'm not sure what advice could help. Let me start by saying that on the surface, my wife, Laura, and I had what seemed like a pretty perfect life. We've been married for 12 years, no kids, not by choice, but that's another story, and both had solid jobs. I'm a software engineer. She's a marketing manager. Things were good until they weren't. Looking back, the signs were subtle at first. I should have seen it coming. We used to have Friday night date nights religiously. Pizza, wine, and a movie on the couch. It was our thing. But lately, Laura's been too busy with work or meeting clients. At first, I bought into it because she's always been ambitious. She's great at her job, and I figured extra hours meant she was aiming for that next promotion. But there was something off. The way she'd smile at her phone, or how her late nights started becoming more frequent, even on weekends. I guess I ignored it because I didn't want to believe what it could mean. It all started to feel wrong about 2 months ago when I noticed Laura was spending more time on her phone, way more than usual. Every little buzz or ding would have her sneaking a glance, and she'd quickly tuck it away. When I'd ask her what was so interesting, she'd give me some half-baked excuse like, "Oh, it's just Sarah from work," or "My mom's sending me recipes again." And I believed her. Well, I wanted to believe her, but my gut was telling me something wasn't right. One night, while we were having dinner, her phone went off again. She grabbed it a little too quickly, gave it a glance, and then flipped it face down on the table. I asked who it was, and she casually said it was a work email. But here's the thing, I work with tech. I know when someone's reading an email versus chatting, and whatever popped up on her phone definitely wasn't an email. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was lying there in bed next to her, listening to her steady breathing, and my mind just wouldn't shut off. What if she was talking to someone? What if it wasn't work? My head was running wild, but I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, Laura and I have been through a lot together. We were solid, right? Still, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. So I did something I'd never done before. I snooped. When she went to shower the next morning, I took her phone. I didn't want to invade her privacy, but I had to know if my gut was right. That's when I saw it. I don't know what I expected, but I definitely wasn't ready for what I saw. My hands were shaking as I unlocked her phone. I knew her passcode, another detail she probably didn't think much of. It only took a few taps to get to her messages, and there it was, a text thread with someone named Ethan. I didn't know any Ethans in her life. The last time I heard that name was in some Netflix drama we watched a year ago. The first thing I saw made my stomach drop. "Ethan, I miss you already. Last night was amazing." "Laura, me too. Can't stop thinking about you." I stared at the screen, not sure how to process it. My mind went blank, and my heart started pounding. I scrolled up, desperately trying to convince myself that this was some huge misunderstanding. But the further back I went, the worse it got. There were messages going back weeks, flirty comments, inside jokes, and descriptions of meetups, ones I now realized were during those client meetings she had been going to. And then I hit the part that I dreaded most. They were planning their next meetup, and the way they talked about spending the night confirmed everything I had feared. They hadn't just met for coffee or drinks. She'd been sleeping with him. I felt physically sick. The trust one had in Laura, someone I had loved for over a decade, was shattered in an instant. My first instinct was to storm into the bathroom and confront her right there, but something stopped me. I think I needed a moment to process it all before facing her. So I put the phone back exactly where I found it, acting as if nothing had happened. But inside, I was already breaking apart. After putting her phone back, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to wrap my head around what I had just seen. Laura was in the shower, singing some pop song, completely oblivious to the emotional hurricane raging in me. I felt like I was living in some alternate reality. How could she be so normal, so casual, when she was doing this behind my back? I didn't confront her that morning. I couldn't. I didn't know how to approach it without losing it completely. I felt like if I opened my mouth, I'd either scream or break down in tears, and neither of those felt like good options at that moment. Instead, I pretended everything was fine, as if I hadn't just discovered the affair. I kissed her goodbye before leaving for work, the same way I had 100 times before, but this time it felt hollow. All day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the messages, the little snippets of their conversations, over and over. I kept picturing her with him, this Ethan guy. What did he look like? Was he younger than me? Better looking? Did she love him? Questions kept flooding my brain, none of them with answers I wanted to hear. But more than anything, I wanted to understand why. Why had she done this? We'd had our ups and downs, sure, but nothing that felt like it would lead to this kind of betrayal. I kept going over every detail of our relationship, trying to pinpoint the moment things went wrong, but I kept coming up empty. That night, I made a decision. I needed to confront her, but on my terms. I wasn't going to explode in anger. No, I wanted to stay calm, collect more information, and be smart about it. I was going to catch her in the lie first, and then hit her with the truth when she least expected it. But little did I know, the confrontation wasn't going to go the way I had planned at all. I spent the next few days playing the part of the oblivious husband, and it nearly killed me. Every time I saw Laura texting on her phone, I had to fight the urge to snatch it from her hands and expose everything right then and there. But I knew if I wanted the truth, I needed to stay patient. My plan? I decided to act as if nothing had changed. In fact, I even started suggesting we spend more time together. Date nights, small trips, little things that used to make us feel connected. I wanted to see how far she'd go with her lies. If she was truly cheating, I figured she'd come up with excuses to get out of these plans. Sure enough, she did. Every suggestion I made was met with, "Oh, I'm swamped with work this weekend," or "I have to meet with the team on that day." I played along, nodding like a fool, but inside I was noting every lie she told. The tipping point came one Friday evening when I suggested we have one of our old movie nights. She looked almost guilty for a second before saying, "Actually, I already told Sarah I'd help her with some campaign stuff at her place tonight. I won't be late." Of course, Sarah again. That night, instead of confronting her, I followed her. It sounds crazy when I write it out, but my desperation for the truth had me doing things I never thought I'd do. I parked down the street from our house and watched her get into her car. She wasn't dressed for a casual night with a friend. She had on a tight black dress, the kind she used to wear when we were first dating. My heart sank, but I followed her anyway, praying I was wrong. She drove straight to a part of town we never go to, a more upscale neighborhood. I tailed her, careful to stay a few cars behind, and watched as she pulled into the driveway of a nice, two-story house. There was a man waiting for her at the door. I couldn't see his face clearly from where I was, but it didn't matter. I knew that wasn't Sarah's house, and I sure as hell knew that wasn't work. I waited for her to go inside, and then I took a picture of the house and the man. I didn't know what my next move was, but I had what I needed. When I got home, I was shaking. The confrontation I had planned to control was slipping through my fingers. All I could think about was the image of that man waiting for her, and her smiling at him the way she used to smile at me. That was when I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I waited for her to come home that night, nerves on edge. My mind kept racing. Was I really about to do this? The minutes crawled by like hours, but finally, around midnight, I heard her car pull into the driveway. I stayed calm, sitting in the living room with the TV on, but not really watching it. She walked in, wearing that same black dress, and when she saw me, her face flickered with surprise, like she hadn't expected me to be waiting up. "Hey," she said casually, slipping off her shoes. "Sarah and I ran late, sorry." Sarah? Again. The lie was like a slap in the face. But I wasn't about to show my hand yet. "How's Sarah doing?" I asked, my voice steady, my eyes locked on her. I wanted to see if she'd flinch, but she didn't. She was cool as ice. "Oh, you know, the usual. She's stressed about the campaign, but we got a lot done." That was it. That was all I needed to hear. "So, is Sarah the tall guy waiting at that house for you?" I asked, my tone cutting through the tension in the room like a blade. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw a panic flash across her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "I followed you, Laura," I said, my voice steady but hard. "I saw where you went. I saw him." There was a moment of stunned silence before she finally responded. You followed me?" Her voice cracked, but not in the way I expected. She sounded more angry than ashamed, like I was the one who had crossed a line. "Yeah, I did," I said, standing up now, "because you've been lying to me for weeks, probably months. I saw the messages. I saw everything." Her face changed in an instant. The guilt I had expected, it wasn't there. Instead, she looked angry, defensive. "How dare you spy on me like that?" she snapped, her voice rising. "This is an invasion of my privacy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even pretending to be. My blood was boiling now. "Your privacy? You've been cheating on me, Laura. You've been lying, sneaking around." "I wasn't sneaking around," she interrupted. "I was just unhappy. You've been so distant, so wrapped up in your work. I needed someone to talk to." "Talk to?" I laughed bitterly. "That's what you call it? You've been sleeping with this guy. Don't lie to me." She crossed her arms and glared at me, like I was the one in the wrong. "Fine," she said, her voice cold. "Yes, I've been seeing him, but it's not what you think. You pushed me away, Jason. You've been so focused on everything else but me. And when was the last time you even asked how I was feeling? We haven't been us for a long time, and you know it." The excuses hit me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't believe she was turning this around on me. In that moment, I realized something. This wasn't about me being a bad husband. This was about her trying to justify something that was inexcusable. She was never going to admit she was wrong. I felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over me, but I knew arguing wasn't going to change anything. I stood there, staring at her, as she tried to paint herself as the victim. And that's when it hit me. She didn't regret any of it. She had made her choices, and in her mind, it was somehow my fault. I didn't know what to say anymore, so I just turned around, grabbed my jacket, and walked out the door. I walked out into the night, my head spinning. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away from her, from that house, from the suffocating weight of betrayal. I didn't bring my phone, didn't grab my wallet. Nothing. It was like my body was moving on autopilot, trying to put as much distance between me and Laura as possible. The night was cold, and I could feel the chill creeping through my jacket, but it was nothing compared to the numbness inside. I found myself wandering aimlessly through the neighborhood, my mind replaying the confrontation over and over again. Her words kept ringing in my ears. "It's not what you think. You pushed me away." I couldn't believe how she had twisted the situation, turning herself into the victim and me into the villain. I had always prided myself on being a rational person, someone who could handle things calmly. But this was something else entirely. I felt rage boiling just beneath the surface, not only at her but at myself. How had I not seen this sooner? How had I let things get so bad without realizing it? I don't know how long I walked, but eventually I ended up at a small park a few blocks away from our house. I sat down on a bench, staring at the empty playground swings, and for the first time that night, I let myself really feel it. The betrayal hit me hard. It wasn't just the fact that she'd been with someone else. It was the lying, the manipulation, the cold way she tried to justify it all. I'd spent over a decade with this woman, trusted her, built a life with her, and now I was left with nothing but a handful of excuses and a mountain of shattered trust. I thought about all the years we'd spent together, the good memories we'd made, and how easily she had thrown it all away. For what? Some guy who probably didn't even know half of who she really was? A fling she'd eventually get bored of? The thought made me sick. As I sat there, I realized something. I wasn't going to fix this. There was no way to repair what was broken. Laura wasn't sorry. She didn't even want to be. And that was the hardest pill to swallow. I had been holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd regret it, that she'd want to make things right. But seeing her face that night, hearing the way she justified everything, it was like she had already moved on. That's when I knew I had to make a choice. Sitting on that cold park bench, it all started to click for me. The truth I'd been avoiding, the one I hadn't wanted to admit, it was staring me right in the face. Laura wasn't coming back. Even if she did, it wouldn't be the woman I'd fallen in love with. Whatever we had, whatever we used to be, it was gone. And trying to hold on to it would only drag me deeper into this pit of confusion and hurt. It wasn't just the affair that ended us. It was everything leading up to it. The distance, the lies, the fact that she couldn't even see what she'd done wrong. For her, I was the one to blame. And if she couldn't take responsibility for what she did, then what was the point of staying in this mess? I realized I'd been living in denial. I had wanted so badly to believe that we were just going through a rough patch, that maybe if I tried harder or paid more attention, we'd get back to the way things were. But that was the past. This was now. And now, I was sitting alone in a park at midnight, my marriage in ruins, because she had decided that we weren't enough for her. A strange sense of calm washed over me in that moment. It wasn't acceptance exactly, but it was close. It was like the moment after a storm, when everything is still and you can finally see the damage that's been done. I knew what I had to do, and it wasn't trying to win her back or fix something that was beyond repair. It was moving on. For me, I got up from the bench, my hands shoved into my jacket pockets, and started walking back. My mind was already turning over the logistics, how I would leave, where I'd go, what I'd need to do. It was a strange feeling, thinking about a future without Laura in it, but there was also a sense of freedom I hadn't expected. By the time I got back to the house, I had made up my mind. I was done. This wasn't my failure. This wasn't my burden to carry anymore. Laura had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. When I opened the front door, the house was dark, quiet. She had already gone to bed, probably thinking she had won that little argument, that I'd be the one groveling or apologizing. But she had no idea what I was planning. I went upstairs, grabbed an empty duffel bag from the closet, and started packing the essentials, just a few clothes and my laptop. I wasn't going to make a big scene or leave a dramatic note. No! I was going to do what she least expected. I was leaving, and this time, there was no coming back. With every piece of clothing I tossed into the duffel bag, I felt a strange sense of finality settle over me. This wasn't an emotional outburst or a rash decision. It was quiet, deliberate, and most of all, it was the only thing that made sense. The years we'd spent together, the plans we made, the life we built. It felt like a distant memory now, something that belonged to another version of me, another version of us. I moved through the house with purpose, careful not to make too much noise. I wasn't interested in waking Laura up for one last confrontation. What would be the point? We'd already said everything we needed to say, or rather, she had said everything I needed to hear. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want her to cry and say it was a mistake. I just wanted out. As I zipped up my bag, I caught a glimpse of our wedding photo on the dresser. The two of us, smiling so brightly, eyes full of promise. We looked so young, so hopeful. I stared at it for a moment, wondering when that version of us had faded away. Maybe it had been happening for years, slowly and quietly, until we were left with nothing but a shell of a marriage. I grabbed the frame and flipped it face down on the dresser. I didn't need to look at it anymore. I took one last walk through the house, checking to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything important. I lingered in the living room for a moment, staring at the couch where we used to cuddle during movie nights, the kitchen where we had shared countless dinners. It felt strange knowing I would never be here again, but at the same time, I was ready to leave it all behind. As I reached the front door, I paused. There was a part of me that wanted to leave some kind of note, a goodbye, something to make her realize the gravity of what she had done. But I stopped myself. Laura didn't deserve that from me. She didn't deserve anything from me anymore. If she woke up and found me gone, good. Let her wonder. I quietly slipped out the door, locking it behind me one last time. The night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. My car was parked in the driveway, but I didn't get in right away. I stood there for a moment, staring up at the house, letting the finality of it all sink in. This was it. I was really leaving. I wasn't sure where I was going or what I was going to do next, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. I wasn't tethered to a broken marriage or weighed down by lies and betrayal anymore. I was free. With that thought, I threw my bag into the back seat, got into the car, and drove away, leaving the life I once knew behind. As I drove through the empty streets, I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to get away. The rhythmic sound of the tires on the pavement was almost calming, like the world was finally giving me a break after days of chaos. The clock on the dashboard read 2:14 a.m., and for a brief moment, I wondered if Laura had woken up yet. Had she noticed I was gone? Did she even care? I pushed those thoughts out of my head. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about figuring out what came next. But that was the thing. I had no idea. I hadn't planned for this. Where was I supposed to go? What was I supposed to do now that my entire life had been uprooted in a single night? I considered driving to a friend's house, but then I realized something. Most of my friends were our friends, people we'd met as a couple, friends who knew both of us, and that complicated things. How was I supposed to explain all of this to them? What would they think? Would they take her side? I didn't want to face those questions just yet. So, instead, I just kept driving. The city's lights faded in the rearview mirror, and soon enough, I found myself on a highway, heading out of town. It was strange. There was no real plan, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control. I could go anywhere. I could start over. I wasn't tied to the life I had built with Laura anymore. I turned on the radio to fill the silence, flipping through the stations until I landed on something soft and familiar. It was a song we used to listen to on road trips, back when we were happy, when we laughed and sang along without a care in the world. I felt a pang in my chest as the memories flooded back, but I didn't turn it off. Instead, I let the music wash over me, knowing that those memories, both the good and the bad, were part of my past now. As the miles ticked by, I started thinking about the future, about what my life might look like without Laura in it. It was a strange thought, being single again after all these years. Dating, moving to a new place, figuring out who I was outside of the marriage. It felt overwhelming, but at the same time, it was a clean slate, a chance to rebuild. I wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. There would be rough days ahead, no doubt about it. But I wasn't broken. Not completely. I still had myself, my sense of worth, and the knowledge that I had done everything I could to make my marriage work. Laura's betrayal didn't define me. It defined her, and I wasn't going to let it destroy me. At some point during the drive, the adrenaline started to wear off, and I realized just how exhausted I was. I spotted a rundown motel off the highway and decided to pull in for the night. It wasn't much, just a place to crash, but it was enough for now. I checked in, grabbed my bag, and headed to my room. As I lay down on the stiff motel bed, I stared up at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. But this time, the weight didn't crush me. It just reminded me that I was still here, still standing, still moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace. The next morning, sunlight filled the small motel room as I groggily checked my phone. There were no messages from Laura. I had expected her to say something, but the silence told me more than any apology could. Then, just as I was about to leave, my phone rang. It was her. I answered, and her voice was soft, almost fragile. She rambled about being confused, how things with Ethan had gotten out of hand, and that it had been a mistake. She said she felt alone, that we had grown distant. She claimed she still loved me. Listening to her, I felt nothing. The words didn't matter anymore. It wasn't anger that fueled me now. It was clarity. She had made her choice long before I walked out the door. She whispered an apology at the end, her voice barely holding together. But I didn't feel any of it. I had already decided, and no amount of remorse could change that. I hung up without another word. The past was behind me now, and I was ready to move on. After the call, there was an unexpected calm. I thought I would feel something more, maybe relief or anger, but instead, I felt nothing. It was like the emotional storm had finally passed, leaving only a strange sense of emptiness in its wake. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I was just done. I drove back towards the city, not with a plan, but with a clearer sense of direction. It was time to start figuring out what my life looked like without Laura in it. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, dividing our life, telling friends, explaining everything, but those tasks no longer felt daunting. They just felt necessary, like cleaning up after a bad storm. My first stop wasn't our apartment. I went to a coffee shop instead, one I used to visit before we got married, back when life felt simpler. Sitting there, I realized I didn't have to rush back into the mess of it all. I could take my time, breathe, and figure things out at my own pace. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life again. No more lies, no more betrayal. Just me, moving forward. Sitting in that coffee shop, I felt the weight of the last few days start to lift. The familiar hum of conversation around me, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. It was all a reminder that life kept moving, even when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And now I realized I was ready to move with it. I pulled out my phone and started thinking practically. I couldn't avoid our apartment forever, but I didn't need to face it right away. Instead, I sent a few emails, one to my boss, explaining that I'd need a couple of days off, and another to a lawyer friend of mine, asking for advice on separating finances and the logistics of moving out. It felt surreal to be making these decisions so casually, as if I was planning a trip or setting up a meeting. But in a way, that detachment was exactly what I needed. This wasn't about fixing the past anymore. It was about building a future. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of control return to my life. For the first time, the idea of starting over didn't scare me. It felt like an opportunity, a chance to rebuild, to live for myself again. I knew there would still be hard moments ahead, awkward conversations with friends, and nights where the loneliness would creep in. But sitting there, I was ready to face them. This wasn't the end, it was just a new beginning. After leaving the coffee shop, I headed to a hotel downtown. I wasn't ready to face our apartment yet, not with all the memories still clinging to the walls. Instead, I booked a room for a few nights, giving myself space to breathe and think about what came next. As I settled into the quiet of the hotel room, I found myself reflecting on the last 12 years. It wasn't all bad, of course. There had been moments of real happiness, love, and connection. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of each other. Maybe it had been happening for longer than I realized. Small moments that added up to the distance between us. It was strange to think about my life without Laura now, but it wasn't as terrifying as it had been before. I could see the cracks in our relationship with a clarity I hadn't had when I was in the middle of it. We weren't who we used to be, and maybe that's why this had to happen. I wasn't the man she fell in love with, and she wasn't the woman I had committed to. What mattered now was finding out who I was outside of that relationship. I felt a spark of excitement, a curiosity about what was next. I could travel, pick up hobbies I'd abandoned, reconnect with people I hadn't made time for. The future didn't have to be shaped by the past. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I could gain. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. It wasn't that the pain or the betrayal had disappeared overnight, but I had a clearer sense of direction. Laura's chapter in my life was closing, and it was time to start writing a new one. I wasn't exactly sure where it would lead, but that uncertainty didn't scare me anymore. I spent the day making arrangements. I called the lawyer, started looking for a new apartment, and even reached out to a few close friends, letting them know I'd need some support. The conversations were hard, explaining the situation without diving too deep into the mess, but they were also freeing. It felt good to let people in, to start building a life that was entirely my own. There were still challenges ahead. I knew that. Divorce wouldn't be simple, and the emotional scars of betrayal would take time to heal. But for the first time, I felt like I wasn't running from the pain. I was walking through it, determined to come out stronger on the other side. As the sun set that evening, I found myself walking through the city, taking in the sights and sounds with fresh eyes. This wasn't the end of my story, just a plot twist I hadn't seen coming. And as difficult as it was, I realized that life had given me something precious, a second chance, a chance to redefine myself, to build a future on my terms. I don't know what will happen next, but I do know this. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the best outcomes. Walking away wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever the road ahead had in store.